Ratzon, Parshat Shlach. Ratzon שהלימוד יהיה לרפואת כל החולים, ובתוכם טניה בת הודה מרגלית, יוסף יאיר בן אביב וחווה, הרב סיוון בן סימה, בתוך כל שאר חולי ישראל. Parshat Shlach is one of the most well-known parshot, dealing with a simple question of why did the Jewish people miss one of the greatest opportunities. They have been preparing for almost 2 years, leaving Egypt, receiving the Torah, preparing the nation, preparing the army, and they're just before that great moment, and they miss it. And when we enter into the Parsha of the Miraglim, the question is specifically about those leaders. The 12 people that entered into the land of Israel on Perek Yud Gimel in Sefer Bamidbar are described as Ele Kiru'ei Ha'edah. These are not simple people. They're not me and you. They're not anything we could even imagine. These are the greatest of the Jewish leaders throughout all of history. And when we look at these great leaders, they had an incredible relationship with Hashem. They knew exactly what Hashem wanted. And therefore, the question on the Miraglim is much greater. If it's someone who is struggling with their understanding of God, then you could say maybe they didn't believe in what Hashem said. But we're dealing with the highest level of spiritual leaders throughout the Jewish history. What was going through their minds when they told the 3 million Jews when they came back from the land of Israel, it's better for us to turn our backs on the dream that we have been dreaming for the last 2 years as free people and 210 years as slaves. This is what kept us going. We're going to go home. But they come home, they come back to the Midbar, and they say, let's not accomplish the dream. And in order to understand what was going on in the minds of the Miraglim, there are 2 questions that the Sfat Emet asks. The first question, he says, U'be'emet yesh li tmoa, meaning there's a great question on what they said. Ma ze she'amru az ha'am Amalek yoshev ba'aretz. When the Miraglim return, they say in order to make the nation afraid, there's a nation that when you hear their name, you shiver. These people, 2 years before when they left Mitzrayim, they saw a nation called Amalek. When you say the name Amalek, there's a shiver in the bones of the Jewish people. And the Miraglim say when they come back, Efes ki az ha'am hayoshev ba'aretz. They're too strong. They're too big. They're too great. Amalek yoshev be'eretz hanegev. Eretz hanegev is exactly where they'll enter. And the Miraglim return and say that right there, the first thing you'll meet is Amalek. That's how they want to convince the Jews to not want to go into the land. So says the Sfat Emet, yesh li tmoa, ve'alo ra'u gvurot haboreh. I don't understand. This nation saw the greatest miracles from Hashem. So what? So Amalek is there. Is that really such a challenge? You have a man in the desert. You saw the sky split open and God say to you, Anochi Hashem Elokecha. You saw the sea split and you're nervous of this army called Amalek? The second question that the Sfat Emet says is, Madua Hamiraglim Nesi'ei Ha'edah Lo Heviu Et Ha'am La'aretz. In other words, the question, what was the motive? I understand what they said, but why did they say it? And on these two questions, the Sfat Emet gives a new understanding of the story of the Miraglim. Just to reiterate the two questions, one is, why do they use Amalek as the idea of fear not to enter into the lands? If you're dealing with a generation that has seen all the greatest miracles in the world from God, Amalek shouldn't be that scary. And the second is not what they said, but what was the motivation of what they were saying. Why did they really not want to enter? And says the Sfat Emet in such an incredible way that there are two types of generations. There's the generation of the desert and the generation of Israel. And he says that the generation of the desert are a generation which Zachu Libchinat Eretz Yisrael Belo Milchamot. The generation of the desert are not a generation of war. They receive and receive and receive. When there's a war, they have the presence of God fighting the war. Come back, the leaders of the generation of the Midbar, and say, Amalek Ba'aret, you'll need to fight, but we're not a generation of war. We're a generation that receives, but we might not be the generation that creates. And so says the Sfat Emet, Shedor Zeh Hayam Mukhan Lareshet Haaretz Bli Milchamot. They didn't want to struggle, they didn't want to fight, they didn't want to have a war, and that's why they use Amalek. They say we are not a generation of fighters. We're a generation of listeners. We listen to Moshe, we listen to God, we listen to the Luchot, we listen to Aaron, we listen to our leaders, but we are not fighters, we are not warriors. And says the Sfat Emet, the generation that enters into Eretz Yisrael are Dor Acher B'madrega Acheret Min Dor HaMidbar. It's a different type of generation. It's a generation that recognizes that listening long term is considered passivity. In order to act, you need to listen. But if you only listen, then you are disabling the idea of the land of Israel. The land of Israel is that it is not the place where Hashem will decide. It is not where Hashem will say. It's where Hashem says, I believe in your ability to receive the responsibility to act and not to wait. The land of Eretz Yisrael is not a land. It's a definition of the idea of our religion. That we needed a generation of listeners, and then we need a generation of actors. We need to know how to receive and then realize that the next step is to create and build. This last week, I was zocheh to finish an entire year learning with many of my students. And one of my students wrote in a letter that going in to 11th grade, they weren't sure about Hashem, they weren't sure about mitzvot, and they weren't sure about tefillah. And they write a little story about a conversation that they had with someone in the class. that gave them a different perspective on Hashem mitzvot and everything that has to do in between of those. So he listened. But in the end of the letter he writes, and I decided to act different because of that conversation. The idea of the Miraglim is that they realize that their generation is a generation of listeners. They're not ready to be the generation of actors. And our bracha entering to the Shabbat of Shlach is that we are all ready to recognize that the motivation of the Miraglim was that they needed to be a generation of listening. But that's why they couldn't go into Eretz Yisrael. The land of Eretz Yisrael is the land which demands and doesn't solve. If you're looking for solutions, you can stay in the desert. If you're looking for a challenge, seek the land of Eretz Yisrael. Shabbat Shalom.